What's up, my fellow Shield Brothers? Shield Brother 6 here with another What If Monday. Today we're going to be doing something a little different without me on the picture. We're going to see how this works. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties, but without that in mind, let's get it started for today with what if the War of 1812 didn't happen, or at least didn't happen the way that it happened in our timeline. Well, the War of 1812, which was from 1812 to 1815, was a conflict fought between the United States, the United Kingdom, and their respective allies. Historians in Britain often see it as a minor theater of the Napoleonic Wars, whereas in the United States and Canada it is seen as a war of its own rights. In Britain, they had the British Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, and in the United States we had US President James Madison leading us. The War of 1812 made the United States grow up some, in my opinion, and Great Britain was the bully on the ocean, impressing sailors and limiting trade with Europe with their blockades. The US was fighting for both legitimacy, seen by some as a second revolution, and for freedom of the seas. The war taught us that we needed to maintain a more professional standing army and not rely on local volunteer militias alone. This had been a point of continual arguments between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, the former stressing the need and later afraid of military dictatorship. Before this, we had a tiny army. The US Army was starting with a 7,000-man army. At the end of the war, we had a 35,800-man army. But anyway, by the winning of the War of 1812, a strong feeling of nationalism arose from the last of the generation, even though we didn't technically win. The U.S. focused on building itself as a result of nearly losing the war. The war gained us respect among the European powers, but in my opinion, the most important result of the war was the foreign policy that would be adopted by the next president, James Monroe, Monroe's Doctrine, which stated the U.S. would be defender of the new republics of Latin America and intervention by Europe would be seen as a threat. How an ironic twist. At that point in time, the U.S. could hardly think such a policy. But Great Britain, however, was building a trade relation with those new republics and therefore found it in their best interest to back the U.S. policy. So, the country that we just fought a war with became an unofficial ally that would later prosper and become one of our strongest allies ever. So, the country that we just had, that we just practically lost a war to, would cement themselves as our ally. This led to a reconciliation that has lasted ever since. This is why we are both allies in both world wars and why the US and Canada have the longest unguarded border in the world. This is why English-speaking countries in the world are all democracies and are all allied with each other. So, if the war never happened, maybe none of this good stuff that came from it would happen either. Most likely, the Canadian province of Ontario would be an American state, or divided into states. Before the War of 1812, many Americans didn't really consider themselves anti-British, per se, and border between Canada and the United States was all but ignored except in the most strategical, vital locations. Because of this, a ridiculously high percentage of Ontario's population was actually born in what is today the American East Coast. Some say as high as 60%. However, those Americans who went to Canada didn't have much government loyalty, and just went over there for free land. If the war hadn't happened, Ontario, or at least southern Ontario, would have been absorbed by osmosis. The War of 1812 was actually very unpopular with most Northern Americans in those states, including those in Canada, and the act of going to war barely passed Congress because of this. Many Americans who were already in Canada refused to fight, and some even joined the Canadians. Due to the invasion from the south, it molded British colonialists of North America into Canadians, and suddenly they had a unified purpose rather than just being a food supplier for England while they fought Napoleon. This reinforced the idea of Canadianness amongst the colonists and gave them a distinct cultural identity. So, if that hadn't happened, we could be seeing a lot less of a Canadian self-identity. And here you can see, on the left is our president, James Madison, on the right is Lord Liverpool. And those are who was leaving our nation, as I said before. And then in this slide you can see the border I was talking about, Northern Theater of War of 1812. And it is very obstructed and very close together, especially with the Canadians, especially Southern Canadians, such as Quebec and York. And if the war hadn't happened, you could see much of that being part of the United States. For the Americans, this would have meant that at the end of this or if we had not had this war, it would be a much smaller military, less frosty relations with the British, a political split amongst Southern Americans and North Americans because the South had wanted to go to war, and 1812 war hero Andrew Jackson would not have been a war hero because he would not have won his victory in New Orleans, meaning he would not have the backing and the experience and the popularity to become president, which would spell a lot of things for the United States if we did not have Andrew Jackson as our president. And as far as strength, the British Army brought in a 5,200 man soldiers and left with a 48,000 military. So they too grew their army in their efforts in Canada. As for casualties, there was about 2,200 to 3,700 killed in America, and the British Empire lost about 1,100 to 2,000 soldiers. So a lot of death happened, and the natives backed the British because they did not want us expanding, which was another thing. If we had not won or fought this war, we would not have the military to expand westward, nor would we have the capability, because we would not have wiped out a lot of these strong native alliances, etc., that had 10,000 plus soldiers fighting us, because 10,000 soldiers were dead or wounded, or at least 10,000 were dead or wounded. Meaning, if that had not happened and we had not weakened those native armies, there would be no easy way for us to move west like we did in our timeline. And talking about this, there was, on our side, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and the Creeks helped us because we pressed them to. And then the British Empire had the Tecumsehs, the Shawnee, the Creek, Red Sticks, the Ojibwa, the Fox, the Iroquois, the Miami, the Mingo, Ottawa, Kickapoo, Delaware, Muscatine, Potawatomi, Sauk, and Wyandotte, and even Bourbon, Spain helped them with Florida. So, if we had not fought this war, or at least if we had not ended the war that we went the way we did, we would not have expanded west, we would not have Andrew Jackson as our president, we would have a tiny military, we would have tiny United States, we would not have been able to expand west, we would not have Florida, and we would not have wound out getting Alaska, meaning we would be a very insignificant country. So you can see how all of this tied together. If we had not had the War of 1812 the exact way that it did in our timeline, we would be, for less of a better word, we would be screwed over. We would not be the United States that we are today. So you can see how a war that is often passed over in textbooks and in lessons for history teachers is actually very significant for the United States, and even for our relations. Because, while yes, we would have some of southern Ontario as a state, we would not have Florida or very much west. And no military to speak of, and no Andrew Jackson. So you can see how, I'm going to end my video here because you can see how without Andrew Jackson we would be nowhere near to where we would be. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed a little bit today. This has been Shield Brother 6 with another What If Monday. If you like this kind of content, leave me a like. If you don't, you can leave me a dislike. If you have any comments, suggestions, or concern, leave that down for me in the comment suggestions. And as always, this has been Shield Brother 6, and I'll catch y'all next time.